Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Friday episode of Star Wars Lads. It's the first Friday episode we've had in a while where we haven't done a Knights of the Old Republic or a Boba Fett related thing. So we are going to be doing a kind of an open discussion here about Star Wars publishing initiatives, kind of book trilogies, and all of that through canon and legends, kind of comparing and contrasting, but with High Republic as the center because next week is basically the last week of the High Republic Phase 1 because Edge of Balance came out digitally, and then Mission to Disaster, which we haven't read yet. We're going to read it when physical copy comes out next week, comes out, as well as Eye of the Storm number 2, High Republic 15. So we are kind of entering the last Phase 1 week of the High Republic. We kind of wanted to do a little retrospective looking at the High Republic and how that publishing initiative compares, not necessarily in quality, but in terms of release strategy and how it's been maintained across the last 14 to 15 months of its release versus stuff like New Jedi Order and all of that. So before we get started, though, please hit that like button down below, subscribe to the channel for Star Wars content minimum 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and comment below and let us know what you thought of the High Republic as so far and what you think of our discussion and what you think of any of the stuff that we're talking about here today. So I'm going to pass it over to Sanak, and he's going to lead this conversation. And here we go.
Yeah, I mean, where do we start? Like, we're obviously both massive canon fans and completionists, but like everyone else, we've started our Star Wars journeys with a lot of stuff that is now legends, right? We've had the movies, we had the video games, and all these things and that, but a lot of it was also like the books and Wikipedia, especially for both of us. So we have a very strong sense of legends, and we were big fans of a lot of the books. But obviously, Legends is essentially it's basically a extinct period. Not that it's not valuable, not that it's not like a great place for stories and awesome characters that I really do want to see in canon. It's it's a little different because when we look at canon now, everything is a bit of a structure. Everything is leading to something. We have three trilogies now instead of just two. Um, at one point in Legends, when we look at these books, especially like the Bantam Ray books, right after the whole success of the Heir to the Empire, like reigniting Star Wars fandom, they didn't have any other trilogy but the original trilogy to reference. So there's a lot of things about that era that we're trying to break down, but kind of put it in the context of the High Republic, like how the High Republic has done things similar to all these initiatives that have come before, and where they've been successful, where we think they have room to grow. Trilogies that are doing similar things to some of the stuff that we've read in canon in general. Like, yeah, so like Liam said, it's very open ended. But I mean, I guess for my initial thoughts, I'm very pleased with the High Republic. It was something that I was like excited for because it's like, yeah, we're finally going to get something that I think a lot of like Legends fans were clamoring for, like real stakes, something that changes the galaxy, something that's not just a here's a quick tie-in with this character you met in an animated show or in the movies. And those books are really good. Like, I haven't personally read every single book out there in canon. I know Liam's read all the Thrawn books, and that initial informal trilogy is still pretty highly regarded. So when we look at something like the High Republic, yeah, it's got stakes, it's got galactic scale, it's got Jedi who are what we thought the prequel Jedi were going to be when that was first kicking off. So we get to see them really in their prime, where they're very nurturing and caring and kind of open to diversity of thought and people. And we have a very different and interesting villain that feels like there's stakes for not just these Jedi, but for this burgeoning Republic, which somehow at this point still is having not issues necessarily, but are kind of still exploring hyperspace. Whether that be because there was a huge, like dark ages in Star Wars before this, or because they just didn't advance hyperspace as much as they did in Legends. That's to be determined. But this first phase has been really fun because while everything is so interconnected, it's like probably the most successful version of interconnectedness I've ever seen in Star Wars. Like, I'm seeing things that are like showing up in the High Republic Adventures, which is supposed to be a kid's comic book, and it feels like there's gravitas there that you feel like you have to read this, you have to read that. There's a sense of completion that for some people I understand is off-putting, but the fact that every single thing so far has mattered. Maybe not the Ty York graphic novel per se, maybe a few things here and there and some of these smaller stories that happen, but it feels like there's a weight to every character. You can read adult novels and you'll still get like 85 to 90% of the story, but you're gonna miss out some wonderful storytelling, some auxiliary and supporting characters in these bigger books, and they themselves are gonna grow into, hopefully in phase 3, to be like the leaders and all that. So there's a future payoff that's already pre-built into these books that once we return to them, yeah, some of these main characters might be old or dead or whatever, but some of these younger characters are now gonna be in their prime or exiting, like barely exiting their prime. So there's something just so uniquely connected, but with so many future possibilities to go to. And we're kind of doing this weird prequel trilogy thing of sorts where we're going back in time, like 150 years before the High Republic. I don't know if it's really considered High Republic at that point. It seems like that's like the beginnings of the High Republic era, but we'll see how that goes. It'll be pretty interesting that they're committed to doing a little bit of a before as well, because I think one thing we were discussing before we even started this video is that a lot of these books that came out initially after Heir to the Empire, they didn't really understand how to do anything that didn't feel very similar to the movies and try to like do adventure after adventure, war after war, battle after battle. But obviously, Lucas and all those people didn't allow these writers to even go before the movies. What happens before? What's going on with the Clone War that was mentioned? What was the last days of the Republic like? That was all stuff that was kind of saved. So it's pretty interesting to see the High Republic is kind of covering a lot of these spots and weaknesses that they might have learned from other initiatives, because now they have a more centralized focus, much more than possibly the sequel writers ever had. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where I'm at so far. It's interconnected. It's maybe a little too much for a lot of people to just dive into. But if you do dive into it, it's rewarding and it seems to be kind of pre-built with some of the earlier publishing initiative flaws kind of accounted for.
I think the High Republic is unique in a sense when you're comparing it at least to the other big three Star Wars publishing initiatives with New Jedi Order, Legacy of the Force, and Fate of the Jedi. When you compare it to those, the High Republic has been more unique in terms of its expanse over different mediums. So we have comics, we have manga, we have uh, graphic novels, we have um, kids comics. We've got like books, junior novels, and young adult novels. So we've got like all of it, and we're covering a variety of different types of characters. We're covering a variety of different types of stories, and I think that for me has been both. It's one of its strengths and weaknesses. I think one of the strengths of it is it's a bit more accessible than those other initiatives because you can say, okay, I'm gonna read the adult books, and you can read all those, and you might miss some things, or like somebody like us, we're gonna be like, "Oh, I wanted to know like that little nugget that doesn't like how did that character get to Starlight Beacon?" Well, if you read the comic, you might know that or something like that. So I think that is a strength of it because it's not too exclusive, right? Like you could treat each part, each group of middle grade books, each group of young adult books, and each group of adult books as trilogies themselves. And they don't, but for me, the weakness is they don't connect like enough in those trilogies sometimes. Sometimes they feature other characters because this initiative, I think more so than all the other ones, is author driven. And the other ones a lot of times have been more story group driven where it's like, okay, this is the story we're going to tell and you're going to tell this part in your book and then I'm going to tell this part in my book and then the other person's going to tell this part in their book and then we're just going to keep rotating. Where this is more okay, the authors are going to come up with most of the story. Maybe the grand scheme of things is going to be more focused on group storytelling and we're going to plan it all out, but how we get there, it's kind of more of an MCU model where it's like, okay, how we get there is going to be up to the writers, but this is what's got to happen. These like five things have to happen basically, and you can tell how that happens. That's kind of what we're looking at a bit more with the High Republic, which to me is interesting. But like as somebody who reads all of it, I think that is the one thing that's a little lacking for me is I want a little bit more through line arc of like, okay, these adult books have Avar, Stellan, and uh, Elzar. Okay, let's follow their arc through the whole thing. And I feel like Stellan
Right, right, yeah.
a couple of the books, but Avar is Light of the Jedi, and then she's comics only. And then
Yeah.
kind of not a huge part of Light of the Jedi. He's in it, but he's not like a central character. He's not one of probably the top two or three most prominent characters in the book. But then he's huge in Rising Storm and Fallen Star. So we kind of have all these characters kind of cycling through. Whereas with the other Star Wars initiatives, you have more of, okay, this is what's going to happen, and these are your 10 characters, and this is how it's going to go all the way through. And maybe each author has their own writing style and their own way of pacing the books, but really the stories are like group stories, and there's just a person writing it and kind of
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I would say that's to me the biggest difference between the two. And both have their advantages and disadvantages. I think, like I said, this way is far more accessible to everyone, where you can get kids involved who might read these books in middle school and then get a little older and they're in like seventh, eighth grade, high school, and be like, okay, I want to read the young adult novels in the High Republic. And then they get a little older, end of high school, and they're like, oh, I want to read the adult books in High Republic. You've got segues for everyone, and then you've got comic fans. So this is, I think, a lot more accessible in that way because you can pick and choose your spots, and you do feel like you get a complete story, I think. But for the most part, since it is so creator driven, sometimes you lose stuff between mediums if you're not consuming everything, but you also might get briefer versions of certain characters that you wanted a bit more with
Mhm.
in favor of other characters because an author who wrote something at the beginning of the initiative wants to bring their character back for a later book, where that
Right.
might not have as fulfilling of a journey in that type of medium as it did in the other type of medium.
No, I mean, I agree. I think if my biggest weakness of this whole phase one has been, it has to be wave three. Not because I don't think the story of wave three isn't good. I mean, we talked on this channel. We love Trail of Shadows. It is still probably one of the old time comic book series from Star Wars that we've ever seen, and that's including stuff that we were reading well before the canon was ever established. It maybe kind of is drawn fully into that Fallen Star story and loses something unique, but it still is very effective and it's very cool and it's an interesting perspective into the politics and the underworld, just the state of the galaxy outside of this huge Jedi focus. And I can see that being a criticism for some people that because it's so Jedi focused, that nothing happens without them, and that a lot of these books try to kind of deal with that by having, look, here's Crash from Midnight Horizon. Here's our Corellian perspective. Here's Affy Hollow, right? Here's our like space guild, space traveler perspective. So we're getting all these different perspectives, and we do get a lot of Niles perspectives. I think that kind of appeases me a lot because we do see a lot of the stuff from the Tempest runners and from Markion Ro as the Eye. We understand a lot of their structure, especially in Light of the Jedi, and just all the actions that they take as groups and different clouds and everything. But the weakness is that because everything comes down to the destruction of Starlight Beacon in phase one, and everyone is kind of drawn into that, that you sometimes feel like, well, couldn't this character have done something else? Aren't there more pressing things? But I do agree, like Stellan Geos, Avar, and Elzar are talked about as a big three. We see them visually depicted as a big three in their youth and all that in some of the comic flashbacks and all this, but they're not a big three in the adult novels like I was expecting them to be. I when I was getting hyped up for Fallen Star, it was because I was like, okay, if we really think about it, Stellan is not present at all in Light of the Jedi, but he's a huge central player in their Rising Storm, right? Elzar is kind of there in Light of the Jedi, sure, good enough, and he's got that pretty strong and interesting end to connect us directly to the Rising Storm. And then Avar is like, she is the top Jedi, everything in Light of Jedi, and then she's just not really there in the Rising Storm. She has like a few mentions, even as completionist when we were reading the High Republic series and reviewing it weekly for you guys. She wasn't really a prominent character in the series because that's the Keeve Trennis story. So by the time we finally get to her in Fallen Star, it's just perspective bites. Like we don't even get her as a main character, or at least like a supporting character, where we could have had all three of them there. I think that ended up being my biggest issue because they spent so much time of it putting that into the High Republic Marvel comic, which has been good. I'm not disagreeing with that, but you could have kept Kiev as the focus there in those books, and then you could have done a lot of Avar stuff in Fallen Star, and I would have been far more pleased. If everything has to narrow down, at least narrow down around our big three. I think that's really my biggest issue there. But because they make the whole story of Fallen Star about the upper half and the lower half, and the book is only centered around the lower half, and everything auxiliary is upper half. Yeah, we do lose out a little bit of like what we were sold, and we get this version.
You can look at like Rising Storm is starting to become the more Light of the Jedi is still my favorite, but Rising Storm is starting to become like the benchmark of the whole initiative because you can take Rising Storm and Fallen Star as like a little duology, and Rising Storm and Light of the Jedi is a little duology. But by the time you get from Light of the Jedi to Fallen Star, they don't necessarily connect as well. And I think that has been one of the failings, I guess, of this initiative too, is I haven't been as clear on how long has passed over it, like how much time we're covering. I think as we start to get into these stories, the story as a whole doesn't feel as well connected as you would expect from something like this. But the end game, like I said, the end game is there. It's just how we get there. Sometimes the authors don't seem to be quite on the same page. Like nobody's contradicting each other, but it's like, okay, I want to do this. And they're like, great, but we're never going to talk about your character who's like the POV of the book again. Or I want to do this, but okay, we're going to treat your character that you wrote in the next book because I'm writing the next young adult book. I'm going to treat that character like that character's not as important or that's a side character for my characters. And then when we finally get back to your characters, they aren't the same person, but we didn't really get to see that evolution fully. I think that's my biggest problem with it. But like each book standalone, if you take each book standalone, they're all good to great. But as a whole, they don't I don't think they flow as well as they could. That being said, we still aren't done with this initiative. So there's a lot more coming. There's at least two phases coming, and this initiative is going
Yeah.
to drag out for at least another 2 years, maybe more. We don't know how long they're planning on going. And then eventually we're going to have connections with video games and with possibly
Acolyte.
TV shows.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of wrap up to be done before that. Acolyte is supposed to be like 50 BBY, like a few only 20 or so years before Phantom Menace, if that. So we have 200 years to get there basically in this timeline. So how are we going to accelerate that timeline? Are we going to accelerate that timeline? Because we've talked about in the past about phase one, wave three, about its if we're going to go in the past, there's so many things to wrap up with these characters now. If we're trying to get to where we are in those shows, and maybe we aren't. Maybe this initiative will continue for another 3, 4 years after those shows come out. And it's like, okay, this is our endpoint. Now you can look forward to how we get there, but this is how we're going to give you all the steps to get there. There's so many things that now I don't want to even see them jump forward in time for phase three if ideally we go back to these characters because there's so many things I want to see happen like immediately after
Yeah.
the aftermath of
Yeah.
these books that now we've got to wait a long time to see how does that connect. And if we jump in time, I feel like that's not going to be as serviceable to the characters. But I trust these authors enough because most of the work is at least good to great. So I trust the storytelling. I think the character work is just the thing where sometimes they falter because the storytelling and the storytellers are so different and have so many different types of stories they want to tell in the Star Wars universe. But I think what really can connect it to the rest of these things that we're talking about too is there does feel like a bit more freedom and liberty with the High Republic, which kind of the new Jedi Order almost marked, right? Because we have
Yeah.
everything pre New Jedi Order, because New Jedi Order started right as the Phantom Menace was coming out. So we've got pre Phantom Menace, Valentine book era of Star Wars with the painted. I love those covers and everything. That'll always be iconic. But we've got that era of Star Wars books where Zahn started it and Zahn finished it basically. But everything else in between is really kind of up in the air, and Zahn spends a lot
Yeah.
of time trying to correct a lot of the things that were put out there. There's a lot of weird sci-fi concepts that are brought in because everybody's basing everything off of 3 movies, and that's it, and it's like, this is my take on Star Wars, but I don't really have any other Star Wars type material to compare it to. So I like this aspect about the original trilogy, and I'm going to tell this strange sci-fi story, even though Star Wars really isn't a sci-fi universe, it's a sci-fi fantasy universe, heavy on the fantasy aspect, less so heavy on the sci-fi aspect. So sometimes you get weird sci-fi stories that don't really feel Star Warsy. Sometimes you get weird fantasy stories that don't feel like they have enough sci-fi. So it's a weird combination of all of it. I think Zahn's really the only one in that era, those like 8 years that really nailed his stories. Then you get New Jedi Order and it restarts everything basically. It gives a bit more freedom because now we've got Phantom Menace style, at least. We don't know what's going to happen in the rest of the trilogy, but we've got a new style to Star Wars that we can pull from a movie. And I think that really helped progress everything forward and give people a bit more freedom to be like, we can create things in this universe instead of just pulling from one or two characters and their character traits and giving them a little arc that ultimately doesn't really change them much for later arcs. We can now start to tell a like actual story with some stake, and there's a lot of controversy over New Jedi Order and some of the things that it does, but I think that's the biggest thing you can compare between New Jedi Order and all the rest of the initiatives with the High Republic is there is a bit more creator freedom to create things and tell stories that actually connect and have consequences versus like, okay, we need the obligatory reference to something that happened in this book that no one liked, but we're going to reference it because it exists. Now, when you have these types of initiatives, you can tell stories that are a bit more expansive that actually have consequences for the universe and consequences for our characters. And I think to me that's the thing that the High Republic I look forward to it continuing in the future because it's not safe and it's not it's telling stuff that we are at least new to us and even new to everybody who's read Legends as well because this timeline has really never been touched. And I think that's a smart way for them to have gotten back into telling important Star Wars stories in books because of the rest of canon being so bogged down with, okay, we're going to tell a Luke story, but we already know what happens to Luke, so it's not going to really be important at all. Or, oh, we're going to tell a Han Solo story, but it's not going to be important at all. Or Jyn Erso story. Like this is where canon has failed to me because the books just aren't that interesting. They could be well written, but they're not that intriguing where Legends used to be endless possibilities because there was nothing to really contradict. Now we have stuff to contradict. I'm glad they went to a period where it's basically undisputed. Like no, there's nothing from Legends really that you can contradict here. There's nothing from canon that you can contradict here. So you can basically create your own new pocket of Star Wars books that everyone can kind of look at and accept. And even if it's written in a style that's different from what you like, at least it's in a era where we don't really have anything to directly compare it to from the past.
Yeah, I mean, to say the new Jedi Order was controversial is definitely an understatement. So a lot of the new Jedi Order was, I mean, I remember just as a kid watching the new Jedi Order like book trailer with Luke Skywalker's voice, and you're like, oh, this is like the great, this is crazy. It's like, was Palpatine planning for this? Like, there were so many things, even in the duology of the Hand to Thrawn duology, I believe it's called that one. What's the last book? Is the Last Command or uh,
From the duology,
the
it's Vision
duology?
of the Future.
Mission, yeah, Vision of the Future. It has apparently the seeds of the Yuzan Vong, the main villains in a new Jedi Order, hinted at. At least I don't know to what extent. I've obviously not read as much any Thrawn material, Legends or canon like you, Liam, but they were definitely working on something that has a thorough storyline, which, as we said, High Republic kind of has. It felt stronger in the first two waves than it did in the third wave. Um, but like, yeah, there's the idea of like, okay, this is our movie heroes. What are we going to do with them moving forward? Like now they have to actually grow. That's actually a stipulation that a lot of writers had. It was like, we'll come, we'll be working together, we'll stick to the storyline, but let us develop these characters. We just haven't been able to. And then the new Jedi Order promised development out of all of them, and they did. They killed Chewbacca off. That was a huge thing that people hated, but gave some depth. It was in a way when you kill off Han Solo in The Force Awakens, you have to somewhat take the story seriously. Even if you don't love the story, you have to take it seriously because that icon is gone. Chewbacca was gone in the New Jedi Order like immediately. And you're thinking, wow, these young kids are gonna grow. They've had so many young Jedi Academy trilogies and all of that stuff. Now we get to see characters like that. And to a degree, the New Jedi Order does do that right. That through line story is great. But it was controversial because this is the first time that these characters, these 2 generations of characters could develop outside of Bantam Ray books, like, for real. And who cares about Anakin Solo when you could see Luke Skywalker change and grow and lead an epic battle and assault against the Yuuzhan Vong? Who even cares about the Yuuzhan Vong? They're not the Sith. They're not like they're you can't use them with the Force. Okay, what's the point of this battle then for some people? It's weird because the whole storyline, I think, as an idea, as conceptually, is really cool because it really puts the galaxy, everyone, the Imperial remnants, the bounty hunters who joined the Mandalorians, Boba Fett as Mandalore himself, working as a double agent with Yuuzhan Vong's, the Jedi Order, the fledgling New Republic, whoever is like a smuggler, whatever. Everyone is dealt with this horrible hand. It's a huge war. It's bigger than anything that the Galactic Civil War ever was. But in a way, how is that fun to read over 19 books? That's a huge commitment for a lot of people, and there's no visual medium to see that. And if you're gonna read these books, the people who are gonna read them the most are the Bantam era folks who want the development of their older characters. By the end, Luke Skywalker kills the main, like, war master. Leia is like has like a whole thing. I forget that all their storylines of these older characters, Mara Jade, all this and that, start taking precedence more and more, that this younger generation is just responding. They're kind of there. They're supporting characters. They're never allowed to grow. And the initial plan of the new Jedi Order was for this generation to overcome and grow beyond, as Yoda says in the Last Jedi. They were supposed to be the ones that grow beyond the previous generation, but they don't. They get sidelined almost immediately because the New Jedi Order story is controversial to a lot of people. People hated Chewbacca dying. People just didn't like the character design and story. You can't really see what's happening, and it's so long for so many people.
I think when we look at it and compare the two, or all the publishing initiatives, at least the High Republic is the New Jedi Order is the closest one I think the High Republic strategy can compare to. And yes, like you said, it's all books in the New Jedi Order. It is all books and ebooks and stuff like that. So there's no visual medium to really compare it to. But and in that way, the High Republic is wholly unique from anything we've ever seen really in Star Wars. But I guess the closest thing could be both Clone Wars shows. But um, when it comes to New Jedi Order and the High Republic, I guess the biggest thing that you can compare is the fact that they both span enormous amounts of time, at least in our like real world. They the New Jedi Order was over 4 years, and the High Republic will probably be about that when it's done, if not more. So they're both expand they're both going out over a long period of time in our real world. And so they're going to have to maintain that stakes over a long period of time. The New Jedi Order also had a large variety of authors on it versus Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi. It was 3 authors and they all switched off. And I think that leads to a lot tighter storytelling. That's like
Yeah,
you could
absolutely.
pinpoint your arcs and be like, okay, these 3 books, it basically divides it into 3 acts. There, you could say these books cover this, these books cover this, and we're all going to write one of them. We're going to use our style, our voice, our way of writing, but this is the story where New Jedi Order and High Republic have the ability to both get sidetracked on things that don't really necessarily matter. And I think also with the way New Jedi Order is published, as well as the fact that High Republic is published this way similarly. High Republic, you've got the adult books, young adult books, middle grade books. There's kind of a tier for like, okay, this is super important, and this is like
Mm,
important, but it's
yeah.
not as important. And then this is basically not that important unless you really like this initiative. The New Jedi Order is kind of structured in a similar way, not using all the different formats, but it's got hardcover book release. Okay, we got 3 paperbacks that all tell this story. hardcover book release. Okay, we got 4 paperbacks that tell this story. Okay, we got 2 that tell this story, and then, like, they publish so many things at once that it was very hard for people to keep up, as well as the fact that some of it just becomes expendable. And so I think the High Republic has that ability to do the same thing. And I feel like it has for a lot of people. I think people are starting to catch up, and this 8-month break is going to be really nice for a lot of people to catch up. And I think, especially going back in time, that is the one advantage of going back in time is that for people who haven't read phase one, they might not have to read phase one to read phase two. And I think that's probably a big part of the marketing for that. But when you learn from the mistakes of the past, I think that's something that High Republic is doing to continue to make itself the most accessible Star Wars publishing initiative we've ever seen. And hopefully it becomes the best, because I think it has an opportunity to do so because of the period of time it expands upon, the amount of characters you can show, the amount of growth you can do. Like you said, reading New Jedi Order, you kind of know, okay, Luke's not going to die. Uh, like
Yeah,
Leia, Han, we
yeah,
know that these characters are probably going to make it through. So who do they kill? Like the guy that Chewbacca with, who's like doesn't really say anything, right? Like, yes, we all love Chewbacca, but Chewbacca doesn't talk and is not a big part of the government. So it's not going to disrupt the foundation of everything we have to kill Chewbacca. But in High Republic, we can kill characters that are foundational to our stories because they're all new. And I think that is the hurdle that a lot of these publishing initiatives in the past, they've had to overcome, the fact that we're dealing with things we've already seen before. High Republic can start new and start fresh. And from now on, if we're doing this type of initiative, I would want it to always be something that has new characters, or at least book only characters, to where you can do things with stakes and constantly have that threat of these people dying or actually getting in some type of danger. And yes, it's still Star Wars, so we're not going to have people die all the time. We're not going to have like major consequences happen all the time. But we've already seen from phase one, characters that are important are going to die, and you don't really know who's going to die. And I
yeah. I
think
mean,
that's a big part of this.
it's why it's so awesome because we also there's so much baggage that people don't understand about how after when these books first came out, Heir to the Empire and that whole trilogy is a perfect storm because there's nothing other than the movies to reference. So you can logically take some leaps. And look, there's elements of that story I do not love. I do not like the Luke or Joris Sabayat. Like, come on, you can do better names. You're saying this, Liam. Timothy Zahn could have done better names. There's some concepts that I don't think, you know, even Zahn fully nailed. His whole idea of cloning just became just such an easy cop out for so many different stories. But when people look at Heir to the Empire, they don't understand that it was like this is what the movies trilogy would be after. This would be the 7, 8, 9 for the story if it was literally built up right after. And today, why we made that original video of Heir to the Empire and canon is because it'd be a perfect buildup of the Mandoverse into the Heir to the Empire storyline. It's all there, and Heir to the Empire, as wonderful and as galaxy spanning as it is not bigger than the movies. It's not. And there are some movies that you can argue that shouldn't have been a movie. Like The Phantom Menace, honestly, I think would have been really cool as a TV streaming show if they came out today. 'Cause then you have a little bit of a development, and then you hit the real trilogy of the conflict of an older Anakin and Padme, and then the Clone Wars you can see for a whole movie. Still have a show to continue it and all that, and then you have episode 3 of some sorts. There are so many things that Star Wars has not done great, even in its biggest formats. But the books are probably the most egregious faults of all of these egregious faults come out, and they're abused in a way. But then you see something like Legacy of the Force. It's good. It's Second Galactic Civil War, Darth Caedus, Jason Solo with his travels, with the pain of losing his brother, with understanding the Force. Like one big thing the New Jedi Order I think absolutely nailed is that it was so devastating and billions and trillions of people in the galaxy died that the Jedi who have come after their own sort of genocide, these new kids who are kind of coming into this already pre-shared trauma that Luke has that he's directly involved in because of his father. Now when they're faced with the consequences of being a Jedi to such an extreme, so many of them die, some of them who survive are grievously wounded, and some people who are better off they have to deal with this trauma. And I think that's when this development really was great for Legacy of the Force. Then you have Fate of the Jedi, which is like, let's understand why Jason Soul returned, why, now there's a fell empire. Why did, and they bring in the whole Mortis arc into that storyline, which is that's when they started getting desperate. That's when they were like, oh, we have to make these books so interconnected with the grander story of the different trilogies. But there's the baggage of the 90s and the late 80s that are still shaping these stories that by the time you want to read something like that, you have to understand all that stuff that came before. So I totally agree with you. We need something like the High Republic to do things that are new and fresh and have characters that, yeah, they can have a Yoda or someone else, but Yoda is sidelined until the very end of Midnight Horizon, and he literally just walks out of the smoke, and he's like, "I'm here to save the day," which is it's lovely, it's wonderful, but they definitely just kicked him away to the curb because they're like, "We can't have Yoda do too much in this era just yet. Maybe some stuff before when he's a little younger, or maybe some stuff in Phase 3, or maybe eventual Phase 4, but right now we have to focus on these characters." I know, like you said, logically in the real world, the High Republic going back 150 years is a great idea, but it also works in universe because now these events take place real world and in universe that can come into phase 3. We're seeing stuff like in the Mandoverse where we're trying to bring a lot of prequel stuff into the original trilogy. You're trying to bring some sequel stuff in it. And it's working, but for a lot of people with the effect of like which trilogy is your best, which one's your favorite. It's kind of hard to fit all those things without changing a lot of what we already know and the effect of all these different trilogies. Whereas in a book, if you're immediately jumping into a prequel era, which the prequels didn't themselves in the movies for 15 years, if you're jumping back in 1 year after finishing Initiative and having all these stories, by the time you jump back in the future of Phase 3, there are elements or even characters that can just show up in phase 3, and you're like, well, I've had time to not only catch up, but to get to know these new characters, and they're all going to come together and coalesce in a very quick way that doesn't feel like disconnected and totally tonally different. Because let's be honest, as much as we love these books and all that, a lot of them were based off of like some of the concepts of the prequels, some of the storytelling of modern day authors, and a lot of people who are original trilogy fans hated that. Absolutely hated that stuff. So why would they even be engaged with the books anyways? Now they think that these books that had their heroes be heroes again and again and again, they like that story. Why would they want to see their heroes fail? And you've read way more books before the Phantom Menace. Like a lot of we've both played KOTOR, obviously, but you finished the Dark Bane trilogy. You've read a lot of different series there, and like you said, Liam, it's a lot more fresh. I mean, I can't really say much, but if you have any thoughts on that,
It it's a time period where, because of, it is a little connected too much to the prequel style, I would say, but it is a time period that, like Legacy in the comics, it's new. Like, you can do whatever you want, and because I think having Drew Karpyshyn having written KOTOR and Bane, you have like two fundamental pillars of the pre-Phantom Menace timeline that is all written by the same person, the same visionary who's able to connect a lot of it. And then James Luceno, who's just like one of the greatest Star Wars writers ever, finishing it up with Darth Plagueis. You kind of have these like three parts to it. Like, you can play Knights of the Old Republic 2, and you can read Revan and Deceived and Annihilation and Fatal Alliance, and you can read all that stuff. But really, the pillars of the pre-Phantom Menace timeline that connect directly to the Phantom Menace, that really hold that era up, are Knights of the Old Republic, Darth Bane trilogy, and Plagueis. So I think that's, but again, it's an accelerated timeline, but you have it over one kind of creator, one person who's kind of outlining the whole thing, and then you bring in a second person who's extremely well versed in this universe. James Luceno has been around since the 90s with, and he's been, all his books reference like
yeah,
everything. And he's like,
yeah.
he seems to be one of the biggest Star Wars like legends nerds and canon nerds out there. But like, he yeah, I think you just have a tighter hand around that stuff. So I think it's a little bit more streamlined, but also it has the benefit of hindsight of being able to come out in an era where you have two different, very distinct styles of Star Wars storytelling to pull from the films, whereas everything pre Phantom Menace and really pre Attack of the Clones has to pull from one source, and how do we make that source fresh while
Right.
also making it feel like the original trilogy? Again, it's having these creators who are staying through the whole time, who have a really strong grasp on the universe. And I think in the 90s and sometimes even in canon, you get people who they just throw out there who are like, hey, you can write a Star Wars book. And sometimes you get a story that doesn't really either feel very Star Warsy or feel like it's diving into things that are important to the fans or at least to the universe as a whole. I think that's where having something like the High Republic, where you have a strong creator driven thing, people start to grasp a little bit more of what the storytelling needs to have in it in order for people to enjoy it and to grasp onto it. And and I think that's going to be the benefit of the future. And yes, all these initiatives have led us to this point. So we have a lot of people like to look at canon and legends as two completely opposite things, but they were built into each other. And we couldn't have had canon and we couldn't have learned from the mistakes of legends for canon without having these 25 years of books before we started of mistakes being made and of victories being made, right? So like we have all this stuff to compare it to. High Republic chose to go the way went because we had these three other initiatives to compare it to, or we have these other different eras of Star Wars to compare it to. We wouldn't have the style that we have now if we didn't have all this other stuff. So Legends is still like very prominent, and I think for a lot of people out there, they look at Legends as like it doesn't exist anymore. Well, maybe it doesn't connect to like the new stuff, but they're still constantly reprinting the stuff. It's still very much so in the mind of Lucasfilm. And it is like a separate universe. Like you can read it, and that's my favorite part of reading Legends now and going back and reading things that I haven't read before is it's a creative, very strange Star Wars universe, and you can read it and you can go, "That was really weird," but now I don't have to think about it again. Like, I think
Yeah.
that was the
Yeah.
best part of the canon reset is because now you can go back and you can read all these weird things, and you can get ideas for things you would like to do in canon, and I have so many more ideas for, like, how to adapt series and things I wanna talk on some of the really weird stuff in Star Wars Legends, but uh,
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that you can like go and go, oh, that's an interesting take. I could see where you might have thought of that idea, but that doesn't really work, especially now. But it's still a fun universe to be there. And
Hey, I mean, it helps that now we don't have to rely on Kevin J. Anderson for every single story. Now we have like a great, fun story group that's going to grow and learn from everything that Kevin J. Anderson did, or from Timothy Zahn and from all these writers. That's the best part about Legends is that we're not forgetting these writers. Half of them are back in. I mean, Timothy Zahn has already done two trilogies
six
essentially.
books, yeah.
Yeah, he just
He's almost
he's
done as many books in canon as he did in Legends.
exactly. It's like we're not forgetting these guys. We're just giving them a little bit of a support structure and giving them good windows to write stuff. And if they want to do something unique and creative, give them that fresh new space. That's why people love the Thrawn Ascendancy story. They find it like Game of Thrones mixed with the Chiss Ascendancy and its whole secrecy, mixed with a lot of elements of Legends put together. And I know you've loved all three books. Like we're not here to bash on Legends, but we're here to give a bit of a criticism to a lot of the baggage that a lot of people just maneuvering their way through this era, just trying to come up with their own stories to have fun in this universe. Hopefully, the High Republic learns from it, and I'm sure the High Republic's going to make mistakes. We've already said Phase Three has a lot of faults to it, but we're hopeful because we know all the good that came out of these different storylines from these different eras of publishing have brought us to the High Republic, and a lot of these things are going to be drawn into the High Republic. And I'm sure 20 years from now, when we see another publishing initiative, we'll be old men on this channel, maybe just saying like, "Ah, now looking back, I hated this part of the High Republic. They messed up this character line, and it looks like so far they've learned in this." They're growing, but at least this you have to at least give some credit to canon. They're not just dismissing everything from Legends. They're taking the 30, 40 years of Legends storytelling and saying, "What can we learn from those decades?"
And they are starting to at least figure out a way of telling these stories in a way that actually matters. And I think that's the thing that most people have been very critical about with canon publishing efforts so far is that when we got legend stuff, most of it or almost all of it mattered, but also we had nothing else coming out that we were worried about contradicting. We had nothing else coming out that we didn't have the possibility of having Luke Skywalker with the CGI face that looks almost like photorealistic in a television show back in the 90s and even up until like this year. So, there was sometimes we are critical of the fact that they're safe, but sometimes if you play it safe, then you have the opportunity to do something that's far more exciting than reading a book about Luke Skywalker. I would much rather see this Luke Skywalker show that could be a possibility now that we have the technology. So you never know what the world's going to bring. You never know what's going to happen. But I think that's a good way to wrap up our discussion here. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Let us know what you thought of the High Republic down below. Do you have a favorite era of Legends? Also, let us know down below there. So if you haven't checked out our other videos this week, on Monday, I posted my top 10 favorite Star Wars stories of all time. You're going to want to check that out. And then this coming Monday, Sunux is coming out. So we're going to do a little 2-part series here for that. Wednesday, we also posted our second to last like official episode of Star Wars Lads Comic Reviews covering the High Republic Adventures 13, which is the final issue of that series. So thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.